Hi flightless bipeds, welcome back to Game Design Rules. Henry Audubon here. Thanks a lot for tuning in. So today I want to talk about rules enforceability, which is the idea of whether or not the rules of the game can be known to be enforced by the players playing the game. Or do you need some kind of external judge or referee in order to enforce the rules of the game? So I want to give some examples of this, but first I'd like to just say that as I see it, there's kind of three different categories of games with regard to enforceability. The lowest, if you will, would be the non-enforceable games. Then above that we have games that are enforceable, and above that, furthermore, we have games that are self-enforcing or automatically enforced. So let's start at the bottom with an example. So what is a non-enforcing game or an unenforceable game? Well, take Go Fish as an example. In Go Fish, you ask other players if they have a certain card, and presumably you're supposed to have the card that you're asking for. So I ask you, do you have any threes? Well, I'm supposed to myself have a 3, but you don't know that. You don't know whether or not I have a 3. So a rule that could be added to Go Fish that would help with the enforceability of it would be to say that when you ask for a card, you need to reveal to the opponents that you in fact have that card. And that should be a rule. It's not adding any information to the table. The only way that it is adding information is if you're cheating and you're revealing that you in fact don't have the card. So that fixes that problem. But there's kind of a deeper problem with the case of Go Fish, because if I ask you for 3s and you have a 3 in your hand, you could say, no, I don't have a 3. And of course that would be dishonest and that would be cheating, and maybe there's ethical problems with that, and I think there are, but the point is that the person who's asking can't know whether or not you're following the rules. In fact, this kind of behavior is really incentivized, because then later, once the other player who was asked if they had 3s has drawn some cards, then they can ask for 3s knowing that the person who asked them earlier for 3s has some. Sorry if that was confusing, but it's a real problem with Go Fish, and there's really no way of solving that problem, because when you ask somebody if they have a certain kind of card, it's not as though they can reveal their hand to you and prove to you whether they have the card or don't. The reason being that Go Fish fundamentally relies on the hidden information of the player's hands in order for the game to function at all. So that's a deep problem, and it makes Go Fish an unenforceable game. And there are other examples of this that I could go into, but I think I'll leave it at that for now. Then there's the idea of enforceable games, and the majority of board games fall into this category, where it's clear you can tell whether or not the rules are being followed during the course of play. So for example, let's say that you have you're playing a board game, you're the owner of the game, you know how to play, and you just explained to somebody else how the game works. You've taught them the rules. And you're going to be playing with them, but you want to kind of just make sure that they are following the rules and playing the game appropriately. So that's a good litmus test for whether or not a game is enforceable. Can you watch a new player from the outside and tell whether or not they are playing by the rules? I mean, let's say that everybody has a hand of cards, and when you play a card, you typically reveal it to the table, right? And it's at that moment that other players can tell by looking at the revealed card, hey, you're not playing by the rules, or yeah, that is how the card works, you are playing by the rules. Imagine a board game that had everyone have cards with special abilities and actions on them, but when you played a card, you kept it face down and didn't reveal it to the table. Well, that would be unenforceable, right? So this category of enforceable games, I mean, virtually every game works this way. I mean, take any board game off the shelf and it's likely that it's enforceable. So like Settlers of Catan or Puerto Rico, something like Carcassonne, something like that. These are all enforceable games. The final category of this enforcement hierarchy is the self-enforcing game. And this is the kind of game that the system that the game rule set is implemented in actually forces the player to play by the rules. And the big category of games that fall into this description are video games, right? In a video game, you cannot choose to break the rules, really. I mean, there are glitches in games, and that's an interesting kind of corner case that I think is worth exploring, but let's just take the case of Super Mario Bros. You cannot cheat, like you cannot choose to jump higher. Like let's say that it was a rule in Super Mario Bros. They tell you at the start screen, hey look, it's one of the rules of the game that you can only jump with 10 jump power, let's say, just to put an arbitrary quantity on it. And then each time you jump, you choose what kind of jump power you want to use. And it's not the case that you could choose to go beyond the limit that they've given to you, right? So this is what I mean, is that the system, the game system, really enforces the rules itself, okay? And the reason that I think this is so interesting is that it really gets at what might be called the demarcation problem between video games and board games. The issues of demarcation are trying to decide whether or not something counts as something. So we might have a demarcation problem of science. That would be trying to determine what counts as science and what doesn't. And there might be really difficult cases like certain pseudosciences that kind of appear to be science but also appear to not be abiding by all of the rules of science. And so there can be some tricky situations that arise. So I really think that this difference of self-enforcing versus just enforceable is the core, it's the fundamental difference between board games and digital games. It's interesting because upon first inspection, I think it's easy to think that the crucial difference between board games and video games has to do with the materials that are used to make them. After all, board games are made out of paper and wood, perhaps, and video games are made out of circuits and springs and sprockets and wheels that need to be turned by little homunculi inside of the game consoles. Everyone knows that. So there's a difference of materials there, and that can lead you to believe that that's the core difference. But actually, I think it's this idea of does the materials out of which the game is constructed force the rules to be enforced? Or is it up to the players to enforce the rules themselves? After all, in chess, let's say, there's nothing stopping you from moving your knight up 3 and over 1 instead of just up 2 and over 1. Right? There's nothing about the pieces that stop you from doing that. Of course, the rules, you wouldn't really be playing chess then, you might argue, but you'd probably be on the winning side of that argument. But imagine a version of chess that perhaps has some clever implementation of magnets, maybe, or something like this, where it's not a video game. It's not as though it's digitized and kind of put onto a screen, but the physical components would force the rules to be followed. So for example, let's say that there were magnets embedded in the board and in all the pieces, and they were somehow able to, through some clever way, they were able to enforce the rules of chess such that when you picked up your horse or your knight, you could only place it on the squares that the knight could legally move to. I mean, you would have to check for checkmates and different things. It could be quite complicated, but it's at least in theory possible. And I think that kind of chess would be quite similar to a video game, actually. So that's, to me, an interesting possibility. On the other end of things, we might imagine, kind of like the Mario example that I was giving earlier, where they give you a jump height and say, hey, don't go beyond this, otherwise you're kind of cheating. We can imagine video games that actually don't self-enforce, don't automatically enforce all of their rules. So for example, what if I had a video game where part of the rules of the game were that you had to play with the gamepad behind your back, right? This is part of the game. It's a platformer, let's say, and you have to play with the gamepad behind your back. Well, the video game can't really enforce that, right? I mean, maybe with motion sensing and the Kinect and things like that, maybe they could. But at least traditionally, a video game wouldn't be able to enforce that. And so that's a weird kind of case. And I think maybe there's some open design space there of giving the players some responsibility to enforce some of the rules. Anyways, something to think about at the very least. So those are my thoughts on rules enforceability and how they can be applied to maybe not solving, but at least getting some clarity on the demarcation problem between digital and analog games, or video games and board games. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please feel free to comment, and thank you once again for tuning in. Until next time.